Welcome everyone to this video on an inspector calls. I'm hoping this video will be useful revision in terms of context, and I'm mainly going to focus on political and historical context with some social context thrown in there as well. I'm going to try and link some of these ideas with some of the main themes and the main characters, so hopefully it'll be really useful for you to go into your exam knowing how you can weave context into characters and into themes. As we take a look at some of the main characters that we see in the text, Mr. Birling, for example, we will probably know that Mr. Birling symbolizes the capitalist greed of the Edwardian era and how J.B. Priestley is trying to nudge us to accepting a more socialist view of England. It's time to move away from those old-fashioned views that Mr. Birling has. Mr. Birling isn't as clever as he thinks he is. He makes ridiculous claims about the world and he doesn't know anything about the real world. The world has treated him very well. He is getting richer and richer, whilst other people are getting poorer and poorer, and he's quite happy with the status quo. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see Mrs. Sybil Birling. Sybil has benefited from all of the excesses of capitalism. She was born into a very wealthy family, and her children are going to continue to be as wealthy as she is. Both of them represent the excesses of capitalism. We see them in a dining room. A dining room is a place of consumption. It's where you eat. And the questions I think we're supposed to ask is, who's earning the food on that table? Who's earning the cigar? Who's earning the port? Mr. Birling and Sybil are earning the money. They're not working for that money. Their greed is coming from the exploitation of the poor. As we go through the video, we'll explore some of those ideas. Mr. and Mrs. Birling represent the older generation, and they're quite callous and quite cold attitudes towards the poor. Eric Birling and Sheila Birling might very well represent a newer, emerging generation. Now, Eric and Sheila are both complicit in the crimes of their family. They have benefited from capitalist greed and they have exploited their power. Eric has exploited his power in order to attain his own gratification. And Sheila Birling has exploited her power quite immaturely to get her own ways. Now, I think what's most important about Eric and Sheila is that we see that both of them at the end of this text seem to have learnt the messages the inspector gave us. The socialist message of the inspector actually resonates with them, and they both are determined to move into a different type of world rather than to reclaim the old capitalist views that Mr. and Mrs. Birling are quite happy to revert to. Now, Gerald Croft is also part of this younger generation, but we might describe him as part of a middle generation. Gerald Croft is very similar to Mr. Birling. When Mr. Birling is making his pontificating speech, Gerald Croft agrees with everything. When Mr. Birling says that we have to look after ourselves in life and that we're not all mixed up like bees in a hive, Gerald Croft shares exactly the same views. When Mr. Birling says that if we don't come down harshly on the poor, that they'll soon be asking for the world, Gerald Croft agrees in exactly the same way. Gerald Croft believes in wage suppression in order to inflate their profits. However, as that middle generation, Gerald Croft does seem to show some kind of remorse for his actions. He does seem to be emotionally affected by what has happened to the woman that he exploited, Daisy Renton as she was known then, but we know her as Eva Smith. Now, Gerald Croft is an interesting character because he seems to show remorse, but at the end of the text he is also willing to revert, like Mr. and Mrs. Birling are. Now, we have to question about Gerald whether he likes to look like a hero, whether he likes to look like a chivalrous person. And it's almost like he has convinced himself that his intentions were noble. Now, the inspector compliments Gerald for at least showing some emotion towards this girl. But at the end of the text, Gerald is fully willing to go back to the old-fashioned, almost Victorian views of Mr. and Mrs. Birling, and he isn't quite ready to build the type of world that Sheila and Eric would like to see being built. Then we get on to the character of Inspector Goole. Now, I think the Inspector is probably the most important character in the entire text, because the Inspector really is the political mouthpiece for J.B. Priestley himself. The Inspector delivers his socialist message, and the Inspector is there to do two things. The first thing he is there to do is to expose the sins of capitalist greed, to expose the sins of the elite. On the other hand, the Inspector is also there to show the consequences of their actions. The Inspector Goole does not say that any of them are doomed. The Inspector does not say any of them are beyond redemption. The Inspector shows them their crimes, shows them the consequences of their crimes, and then gives them a choice at the end of this text. On the one hand, they can move forward into a socialist world and perhaps protect the millions and millions and millions of John Smiths and Eva Smiths in every working town across this country. It's what all of the characters could choose to do. On the other hand, he gives us the prophecy of what will happen if we don't learn that message. And if we don't accept a socialist view of the world, then we are going to learn that message in fire and blood and anguish. Now, there's lots of consideration of Inspector Goole as to whether he is a ghost or whether he is a real character, and I think to purely see the Inspector as a ghost would be a juvenile way of looking at the character and the text and the messages inside this play. Now, in lots of Victorian literature, there were often ghosts used, and nearly always those ghosts return to give a message. They have learnt a lesson, and they want to alter the course or alter the fate of their characters or their societies. The Inspector comes to the capitalists inside that dining room to show them what the future will look like if they don't mend their ways. Now, on the right-hand side of your screen, I've included Eva Smith, who is a character that could very well turn up into your exam. And Eva Smith clearly symbolizes the hardship and the suffering and the exploitation the poor went through during the course of this play. Now, Eva Smith is a talented character. She is a good-looking character. She is a hard-working character. And yet all of those positive aspects are completely ignored by Mr. and Mrs. Birling, who assume that she is lazy, assume that she is not very well behaved, and assume that she must have deserved her fate. Now, I wanted to put Edna on the screen as well, because Edna, even though she says very little in this text, is also quite important. She's not going to turn up as a character for you to analyze in the exam, but Edna, throughout the text, observes what it is like to be rich. She sees them consuming their food and drinking their port and smoking their cigars, and Edna has to witness it. She's almost silent, she's almost robbed of a voice, and I think she symbolizes the powerlessness of the poor. They would see the excesses of capitalism and are completely powerless to say or do anything about it. It is the Inspector who has the power to hold them to account, and it is the Inspector who gives a voice to those two people on your screen who didn't have one. We never hear Eva Smith in this text say a single word because she's dead. The Inspector gives her a voice. We never see Edna do anything apart from accept her duty. It is the Inspector who gives the proletariat at this time of England a voice, and he forces the bourgeoisie to listen. If we are going to understand the context of this text, we need to realize that the play might be set in 1912, before World War I, The play was written by J.B. Priestley in 1945. Now, there is a big gap of time there, and massive world events happened that led 1912 to seem like a distant relic of the past, and 1945 to feel like we're on the precipice of creating a new type of world. And we need to create a new type of world because we can't continue in the way that we have been for a long time. Now, I'm going to describe 1912 as Edwardian England. Edward was on the throne at the time. And during Edwardian England, we had quite entrenched hierarchical societies. I'm going to call 1945 post-war England, because after the war, there was a real appetite for change. People had started to learn the lessons of World War I and World War II, and they started to realize that if we don't change, we're going to repeat ourselves. We will have a World War III and it will be the end of us. World War II ended in nuclear explosions in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It's potential annihilation. Now, the warning that the inspector gives, fire, blood, and anguish, it's a biblical warning, but it's also a warning that mankind are on the eve of destruction. And if we don't learn these lessons, there will be no one else to pass these lessons on to. Now, in 1912, we had fairly entrenched social hierarchical structures. Now, at the bottom of the pyramid, we have the proletariat. The proletariat is a name used to describe the working class. Now, the proletariat, they swap their time and their physical labor for wages. That's how the society would work. The proletariat were very often born into the proletariat and had very little chance of escaping being working class. No matter how hard they work, no matter how lucky they are incredibly unlikely to ever have spare money for enjoyment, enough money to feel comfortable. They'd never have enough money to pass on to their children to escape from the proletariat either. Now, the middle of this structure becomes the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie generally are business owners. We might describe them industrialists. The bourgeoisie would have businesses that provided them enough money not just to live, but to also enjoy themselves. And what J.B. Priestley shows us is that the comforts of the bourgeoisie are not earned by the bourgeoisie. The comforts of the bourgeoisie are earned through the exploitation of the poor. Those middle class people would employ the poor to do the work that they don't want to do, but it is the bourgeoisie that would have reaped the profits. And I think part of this text is to show how unfair it is that simply being born into a family that owns a business is just lucky. They don't work harder, they're not better, they're not stronger, they're not more impressive, they're just lucky. Now, at the top of the pyramid, we might consider them to be the aristocracy, and the aristocracy have so much money that they don't have to earn anything themselves, and they can mostly enjoy their lives. They own huge amounts of land, they've been born into family wealth, and J.B. Priestley is trying to show us how unfair it is that life is a lottery. That if you are born into the aristocracy, you're going to have a wonderful and terrific life and not have to worry about anything. And if you're born into the proletariat, you're going to have to suffer and go through hardship. And as time moves on, and I hope in today's society this social hierarchy is a little bit more fluid, and that if you do work hard, then you do have an opportunity to improve in your life. We do live in a more meritocratic system today than we have in the past. A meritocracy is a society that if you are hardworking and talented, then you will be able to earn more money, you will be able to have a more successful life than those who perhaps are lazy or don't value their education. 1912 was not a meritocracy. So with a play that was written in 1945 and moving towards a socialist England, And with the play being set in 1912, looking back at a time of rampant capitalism, J.B. Priestley wants to show us that if we continue with our old-fashioned views, then we're going to revert, we're going to regress, we're going to go back, and that it's time to accept socialism. Now, I think the whole point of this play is to encourage people to change their political views, to give socialism a chance, and to see capitalism for what it really is. Now, as I'm making this video, I'm going to try and be really careful not to share my political views. It's not my job to convince you that capitalism is better than socialism or socialism is better than capitalism. But the text very, very heavily leans to the left, which is a socialist view of the world and how we need to look after each other and we need to make sure that everyone has a chance at success. And it is rejecting those right-wing views that greed is good and that capitalism will help people and that if you have money, you should be able to use that money to generate more money. Now, a capitalist society is one that has an economic system that is based on private ownership. To be able to own assets that you have been able to earn money for, and then use those assets to continue making more and more money. Now, in capitalism, you have private groups or individuals owning things, very often resources, property, or land. And they use those assets as a way of producing goods or offering services. They run these businesses with the goal of earning more and more money. And the way they earn that money is by employing workers to do the labor and pay them a wage for their time and effort. In this type of system, they keep the profit and they pay the wages to those people they employ. Now, one of the central aims of capitalism is to accumulate more and more capital. The purpose of capitalism is for people to be encouraged to earn more and more money. There are benefits of capitalism. Considering the kind of motto of capitalism, which is greed is good, businesses are in competition with each other. And when you're in competition with someone, you make products that are better and more affordable. And that means that your business will prosper and that you will earn more money. So the person who is buying from your business is getting a better deal, but you also are getting a better deal because you're earning more money. Capitalists must make sure that they don't pay too much for labor or materials, and they make sure their profit margins are as high as possible. So in a capitalist society, we have profit margins that are high, and then labor costs are normally suppressed. In a capitalist society, people are rewarded for their wealth, not just for their effort. Very often, prosperous capitalists work less hard than their employees, but they make more money. So the money kind of floats to the top. So those people are incredibly good at business. They might generate more wealth. And those people who are willing to work for somebody else generally acquire less wealth. Now, people who don't work in a capitalist system, or perhaps they can't work, they're not considered as valuable because they cannot contribute their labor. Now, if this is considered a benefit of capitalism, it means that hard work and sacrifice is incentivized. As a negative of capitalism, those people who maybe are unwilling or unable to work, they're not going to be able to have the levels of support that they need. Now, in 1912, the Prime Minister at the time was Herbert Henry Asquith, often known as H.H. Asquith. He was an incredibly wealthy man himself. He was a lord. He was born into huge amounts of money. But he was in charge of the Liberal Party. And he was in charge from 1908 to 1916, that time before the First World War and just into the First World War, and the time when this play is set. On the other hand, at 1945, we have Clement Attlee in charge of England, and he had a different party, and it was a newly elected party, because in 1945, the time this play was set, England were ready for a change. And for the first time, they voted for the Labour Party to take over, and they voted for socialism to be the new ideology of England. The Liberal Party of 1912 had a laissez-faire attitude towards the economy. Now, laissez-faire means leave it be, or let do. Laissez-faire means they didn't want to have too much government intervention. It's not the government's job to get involved. Let's leave it as it is. Let's allow capitalism to continue. Let's allow capitalism to be rampant. Let's not get involved and change it. So that hands-off approach to the economy of the Liberal Party is perhaps why in 1945 people wanted a change. The Liberal Party allowed capitalism to prosper, and they did very little to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. I want you to think about who Mr. and Mrs. Birling were likely to vote for in 1912. They were unlikely to vote for a newly emerging Labour Party that wanted to improve the lives of the poor and introduce minimum wage, because that would damage their profits. They were far more likely to vote for the Liberal Party, who would stay away from their affairs and allow them to continue to exploit the poor in order to generate more and more wealth that they can pass on to their children. Now, during this time, there was growing discontent towards the Liberal Party. There were parts of society that were starting to question whether that type of approach was sensible, and we had increasing tension between employers and their employees. And we see this in the fact that the people who are employed by Mr. Birling were starting to ask questions, and they were starting to hold strikes. Now, Eva Smith was one of those people that was elected to be the voice piece of those strikes in the factory that Mr. Birling owns. Now, that tension between employers and their employees was really bad for those industrialists because it would damage their profit. So people like Mr. Birling would have been really angry at the poor demanding more wages. Now, that growing tension did overspill into strikes in 1911 and in 1912. In 1911, you had the Liverpool transport strike, and then you had the 1912 coal miners' strike, which lasted for almost 40 days. And all they were asking for was minimum wage. Now, that minimum wage is excellent for the poor because it means they're going to be at least valued for the hard work that they put into the system, so that they do actually get rewarded for that level of commitment and that level of industry and that level of sacrifice. But a minimum wage is really bad for those industrial elites. You know, the bourgeoisie wouldn't be happy for the poor to get more money because it means they will not be able to reap as much profit. I've put this image on your screen to show what the Labour Party wanted to start to dissolve and what J.B. Priestley wants us to see. On the left, we see the attitude of Mr. and Mrs. Birling and Gerald. They're quite happy for things to continue. They're quite happy for the status quo to be maintained. Keep things as they are. Life is great. Look at all the food that we're consuming. And it's quite an unpleasant image of, probably quite a fat Mr. Birling, eating and drinking as much as he wants, celebrating the money that he has. It's quite an unpleasant image. On the right-hand side, you have the lived experience of the poor. Now, the poor wanted things to change, the rich wanted to keep things as they are, and in 1945, the needle tipped over into more people wanting change than wanting that system to continue. I think one of the biggest catalysts for desiring change from capitalism into socialism was the horrors of World War I and the fact that we didn't learn our lessons and we had a Second World War II that ripped the world apart. Now, during World War I and World War II, you had men fighting on the front line, and for the first time in a long time, you might very well have had the rich being in intimate contact with the poor. For Mr. Birling, his house is outside of the city that his factory is based in. He doesn't live next to the employees. He doesn't know how they live. He doesn't know how little money they have. I think that's one of the references to Sheila. Sheila hasn't got a clue. She's completely ignorant of the way the real world is. But during World War I and World War II, the rich may have fought alongside the poor. The rich will have realized that the poor fought really, really hard for their country. And there was possibly an increased brotherhood between the rich and the poor for the first time in a long time. Now, after World War I and World War II, huge amounts of soldiers returned to England and they were maimed. They were physically damaged, they were emotionally traumatized. And after World War II in 1945, that collective sympathy for our fellow man is probably what made people decide to vote for socialism rather than capitalism, to accept that the Labour government and their plans to help the lives of the poor was the right solution, and that it wasn't just about the rich maintaining their wealth. Now, that sympathy came in the form of wanting the world to be fairer for everyone, not just for some, and that's why we have an NHS today. The Labour Party created our NHS so that everyone had equal access to medicine. And it was also because after World War II, there was this collective effort to build their way out of the war, and that would improve the economy for everyone. But World War I and World War II were huge for changing people's political views. Now, I really believe that the inspector is warning us that if we don't move to a socialist way, or if we don't accept the political party and the things that they were doing to improve England, that there would be a World War III. And a World War III would be the war to really end all wars. So I think World War I and World War II are incredibly important for the messages that are in this text. Now, in this play, I think some people were willing to accept that message, but I don't think Mr. Birling or Mrs. Birling believed it was time for change. For them, they wanted to maintain the status quo, continue their capitalist avarice, and to continue to grow fat on the exploits of the poor. There are two characters who start to accept this change in tone. For Sheila, she was ignorant of these issues at the beginning of the text, but she goes through a metamorphosis and becomes more of a modern woman at the end of the text who wants to learn from the horrors of the past, wants to learn from her own actions, and to become a better person and to build a better world. So Sheila, I would argue, is ready to accept those changes towards the end of the book. And I think Eric also is horrified by his crimes when they've been made obvious to him. And he also is beginning to move forward as a modern man, ready for a change and see the poor for what they are, fellow humans, not things to be exploited. Now, Gerald, I think, would like to believe it's time for a change, but he is so happy to move back into those old-fashioned views that he doesn't accept the change that he could have accepted. For some of the characters, they signify the kind of collective national spirit, that it was time to look after each other a little bit more. And for the older generation, they revert to exploiting people rather than wanting their lives to be better. Now, when England voted for the Labour Party, I think J.B. Priestley is writing this play as a way of generating support. We voted for the Labour Party. It's now time to give them time to change our world. Accept it. This is what we want. This is what everyone wants. And he asks his audience, I think, if you see Mr. Birling in yourself, then you are guilty of his same crimes. If you keep looking at the poor as inferior, then you are Mrs. Birling. And what he asks for is some compassion and some change in the audiences who came to see his play. Now, what he's really advocating for is accepting socialism. Now, socialism is a 19th century concept, and it was kind of created to help improve the standard of living for the working classes, because it realizes that capitalism overly benefits the rich, unfairly benefits the rich, and unfairly punishes the poor. Now, the purpose of socialism is to create a more equal society where everyone can be treated more fairly. In socialism, there is a belief that the rich don't deserve more simply because they were lucky enough to be born rich. And also, they believe that the poor aren't deserving of their poor simply because they're poor or born into poverty. And there's a view that the poor are not poor because they are lazy or without ability. In socialism, poverty theoretically shouldn't be possible because the profits made by state-owned businesses are shared out equally with the workers, not kept by wealthy owners. In a socialist world, money is spread out more evenly, so everyone benefits, rather than money floating to the top so that those rich industrialists take it all. Now, no one can be exploited for their labor in a socialist society because everyone contributes and everyone benefits. J.B. Priestley and the inspector present us two types of role models. Are we going to be the type of person that the inspector wants us to be, which is having a socialist attitude towards the poor? Or are we going to be the type of character that has a Malthusian attitude towards the poor? Now, I'm going to use the word Malthusian deliberately because this really shows us the type of person that almost wants to go back to Victorian hardship rather than move into a future where the poor are treated as humans. Now, Malthusian comes from Robert Malthus, and Robert Malthus wrote an essay arguing that poor should have difficult lives to stop them being poor. Now, Robert Malthus had a Poor Law Amendment Act, a law that was deliberately there to stop poor people from claiming too much charity. And I'm using the term Malthusian deliberately because I think Mrs. Birling really is Malthuistic in the way that she thinks. Now, a Malthusian attitude towards the poor is believing that the poor are lazy and deserving of their poverty. And I think both Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling make reference to the fact that Eva Smith is beneath them. Wasn't doing her work properly, was she? Mr. Birling's assumption was that Eva Smith wasn't a hard worker, even though he knew that she was. We've got the same thing with Mrs. Birling. Mrs. Birling says, girls of that class. She looks down at Eva simply because of the social class she was born into. A Malthusian attitude towards the poor is to not incentivize charity or support. And if someone was going to claim any support or charity, to make them work for it, to make them suffer for it. Now, and I see this in Mrs. Birling most obviously, they believed that it was important to make conditions unendurable for the poor, so that they would do everything possible not to have to claim it. Now, during the Victorian era, you had Victorian workhouses, and if you wanted to claim support, you had to live in a Victorian workhouse and you had to work in the workhouse, and conditions were horrific. Mrs. Birling feels like Eva Smith should suffer because she made poor decisions. Now, the irony is Mrs. Birling has a prominent position in a charity. Her job is to help people. Mrs. Birling deliberately doesn't want to help Eva Smith because she wants to teach her a lesson. A socialist attitude towards the poor is very different. A socialist attitude would be that the poor don't deserve their poverty at all. The vulnerable should just receive support without having to endure hardship. A socialist attitude suggests that charity should be given generously, not withheld for some kind of moral superiority like with Mrs. Birling, and that the poor should be treated as fellow human beings, not as inferior creatures. Now, if Mr. and Mrs. Birling have a Malthusian attitude towards the poor, both Sheila and Eric both recognize Eva as a human being. Now, the inspector shows us we have a choice to be like the cold-hearted Mr. and Mrs. Birling, or to start to accept a socialist attitude towards the poor. Now, in your exam, I always want you to remember that there is a person behind this play. There is a person writing. J.B. Priestley was a socialist. Now, during this time, there were people who would look down at socialists as people who were overly positive and optimistic, and they don't live in the real world because they don't understand that socialism is impossible. And J.B. Priestley, throughout the course of the novel, shows the types of views that look down on socialists. Mr. Birling refers to socialists as cranks. He insults them. And he talks about, these H.G. Wellses and Bernard Shaws, other socialists, in a negative light. So don't forget that there is someone behind this play. His voice comes through the inspector. And he's deliberately presenting us a choice. Do we want to revert to those old-fashioned Victorian Malthusian attitudes towards the poor, or are we ready to move forward? We've learned the lessons from World War I and World War II, and are we ready to build a society where all can prosper, not just a selected elite few? I want to give you this sentence because I think it sounds incredibly impressive, and also it really exposes what this play is for. I think an Inspector Calls is a political diatribe. And a diatribe is a scathing verbal attack. I think he is exposing that capitalist greed is built upon the exploitation of the poor. Now, the light that steadily increases throughout this text, it changes from pink and intimate, the very intimate capitalist colour, and it is moving into a harder and brighter, because he is turning the lights on. He's showing us our sins, and he's given us an opportunity to atone for them. That was a really quick run through of some of the essential context I think it's important to just reawaken before you go into this exam. I've covered the historical and political context, but there are some things that I haven't covered. So, for example, during this time, women were fighting for their rights to be able to be seen as equals and to be able to have a political voice too. I might cover that if I take a look at the characters of Sheila, if I get that far in making videos before your exam. There are other things that I haven't mentioned either, and I'll endeavour to do that if I can keep making videos this afternoon and this evening. I really hope this is useful. If there's anything in this video that you haven't covered with any of your other teachers, please don't panic, please don't worry. If you've managed to comprehend what they mean, amazing, you can use them in an exam, but don't worry, you don't have to mention absolutely everything that I've put in this video. I really hope this has been useful. I really hope that some of this will come out in your exam, and I'm praying you get exactly the question you want to show off all of this knowledge. I'll try and put out 1 or 2 more videos this weekend so that you have everything you need ready for your exam. Massive good luck. I'll hopefully see you in the next video.